All right. Well, everyone, thank you guys for tuning in to our webinar, Market Dial, a case for in-store testing. Before we kick things off, we're excited to go, but we're going to do a quick introduction to our speaker, Morgan Davis. Morgan is the CEO of Market Dial, a leading retail analytics company. Prior to founding Market Dial, Morgan worked at the Boston Consulting Group in its consumer practice area, serving clients in the retail, restaurant, consumer goods, and travel industries. And with that out of the way, I'll turn the time over to you, Morgan.
Thanks, Fraser. Really looking forward to diving in, and without much more content here, we can dive right in. Excited to get at it. There'll be some time at the end for questions as well, so feel free to bring those up as needed. You can chat into the chat functionality here for the webinar. Will allow you to send questions to Fraser, and then he'll batch them up and ask them at the end if there's any questions there. So with that said, let's jump in here. Here's our quick agenda for today. We're going to talk through these bigger buckets with a lot of context underneath, but really the goal here is to talk about why testing matters and how that gives an advantage for companies, and why there might be some misconceptions or things that can get in the way of testing, and kind of how to shift your mentality around that, and how to help your org change around those misconceptions. And then we'll sort of bring it back together with the value of being able to kind of see into the future, if you will, with that. This is really the crux of it. Companies that test do better than companies that don't. And that concept really will underpin everything that we talk about today, that it drives better revenue for you, more value for your customers and shoppers. And it's just very, very important to have this underpinned throughout the entire organization. And that's what we're going to use as our underpinning for this discussion today. Just a very brief background on me and on Market Dial. Fraser was kind enough to give the kind version of my background here, but when I was working as a management consultant is really where the genesis of this came from, where I had a lot of clients who we did a lot of great work for. And all of those clients were in the retail, restaurant, CPG, FMCG, travel and tourism, all the consumer practice area for the Boston Consulting Group. And the problem that I saw there was we would do a lot of great work. They would have their own teams doing amazing work. And at the end of that work, we were left with this really uncomfortable position, which is we're either going to accept or reject all of these ideas that we came up with here. And it just didn't sit right, because it put these clients in a really sort of bad situation to have to just trust the consultants or trust their teams, or to ignore the consultants and the teams that they spend tons of money and resources and hiring and managing and all that kind of stuff. When in reality, neither of those two are the right path, right? What needed to happen was take all of those ideas and run them through the scientific method and process. So we had stopped on hypothesis generation there. We need to finish that and run through experimentation and rigorous analysis before we could make the call on which ones of these needed to be accepted, which ones need to be tweaked, and which ones need to be rejected ultimately here. And I saw that really big pain and at that point, and the reasons why people weren't doing that, and we'll talk about some of those today. But that was the entire reason we started the company, is to fix that problem and to do it repeatably, accurately, and at scale for retailers, broadly speaking, folks in the retail space. The big takeaway from me, though, from this, and we've talked about this before, is that testing is the thing that drives success in an organization. It's better for you, better for your customers, if you know which of the things you're doing are going to work, and which of the things are not going to work. And not only internally, it's important with you and your customers, it's externally important as you think about your competition in whatever space you're playing in. If you're testing and you are driving your business forward and innovating on that, and you know which things are going to work, you will easily beat those who aren't finishing that job as well. A test can go one of a few directions, basically, and this is vastly simplified. Our data scientists might have qualms with this, but this is really how these outcomes can be bucketed, which is a good outcome, or the expected outcome from a test, is that you get proof and evidence of a positive outcome. So if you have a pricing initiative that you want to do, we want to lower our price and we think we're going to make up for it in volume. And so we have that hypothesis, we run an experiment, and it is proven to be correct. Our price move was more than made up for in a volume change, and so the margin dollars are net positive. So that's great. Everybody's excited. Everybody's high-fiving. The problem is about a third of your ideas fit into that bucket. This middle bucket takes the plurality of outcomes here. A good portion of fit into this middle, which are neutral lift, meaning you ran a new labor initiative. You wanted to add more labor to the stores. Your hope was that you'd have higher conversion rate because your customer to associate ratio was better, whatever it is. And it just didn't drive the value that you hoped. Conversion didn't increase in the right level, or it didn't increase enough that you could be confident in those results. And from that's not a failure. What you learned from there is that whatever you didn't significantly hurt or benefit the business. And it still might be something you want to implement and you want to go forward with, but just you have new data to supplement that, to say, well, it's not a story about conversion rate, but we still want to add more labor. And you might find things like when there's more labor in the store, our turnover goes down, or our employee churn goes down over time because they don't feel so burned out, or whatever you learn. But the story isn't clearly that it drives better conversion rates, and that can be fine. There's a bucket, though, here at the bottom, which is really important, and maybe the most important here, which is proof of negative lift as an outcome of a test. And what this looks like is, go back to that pricing example up front, is we're going to lower the price and hope to increase volume such that our margin dollars are net positive. Instead of that working, you lower the price and units stay exactly the same. So you're just giving a discount to the consumers that were already going to buy. Your margin dollars decrease in a big way because of that. That is a very bad outcome for all involved here. And so that is one that we need to understand and nip it in the bud as soon as possible and as cheaply as possible. And about a quarter to 30% of your ideas, generally speaking, throughout retail and our experience in many clients running thousands of experiments, 25 to 30% of the initiatives that are tested fall into that bucket. The big question is, which of your initiatives that you're running today have fallen into that bucket? If you look backwards a year, can you clearly point out the 25 to 30% of things that were clearly negative? And if not, what's happening is we're combining all of those together, and we are minimizing the positive outcomes of the positive lift, and we're ingesting that with the negative lift. And so really, at best, we're driving maybe a neutral sort of outcome for the business. Comps are flat or whatever, when in reality, we want to get confidence around the good and execute against those. And we want to be able to kill the bad ideas quickly and as cheaply as possible. And that's the whole point of testing, is to find which one of these places your initiative is falling into. Like we talked about before, there's lots of reasons why people don't do this. We're biased. I don't think you should run any initiative without having tested it thoroughly, especially not one that you're going to invest CapEx or OpEx into in any significant way. And so, as we think about this, we hear from people that we're talking to, our customers, or people that aren't our customers yet, why they haven't sort of adopted testing as a rigor and a business practice into their org. They tend to fall under these buckets of the reasons why we hear people aren't testing. And we're going to go deep on each of these and talk about the pros and cons and why a mindset shift might be in order to help us think about each of these a little bit differently. So the buckets are as follows. So the cost of testing could be really high. There's a fear that testing adds an extra step that is expensive. And similar to that, that extra step of testing can slow us down and make us less efficient in how fast we can process ideas. The third is we just don't have the team. We don't have the capability. This is a really statistically complicated discipline. So just the ability to do this is outside of our skill set in the org. And then fourth is just we haven't adopted the business practice. It's just not a part of our habit. And so it's a huge organizational change to be able to adopt that. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about each of these specifically. And as questions come up, happy to take them, and we can batch them at the end and jump back to these slides if that's helpful. The first of these, misconceptions is that testing is really expensive to do. It adds an expensive step. We have to slow down our process, but that on top of that, it's not just time, but expense. We're going to put this in some stores and let it go for a long time. We're going to invest in new labor. We're going to re-merchandise the store. We're going to do whatever, and that can be expensive. And the flip side of that coin is, if we think back about what the likely outcomes of the testing are, is, the likely outcomes, if you kind of cut it down, or if we can learn that this initiative was a good idea, or we can learn that that initiative is a bad idea. And implementing one of those really bad ideas is much, much more expensive than any of these incremental sort of experimental costs, if you want to think about it that way. And so it does come from a different bucket. One of them is an opportunity cost bucket. One of them is a future, margin dollar loss bucket. But compared to maybe we have to hire a contractor to go remerchandise a few stores bucket. And so the cost is different in what buckets they come from, but the overall impact of this is really, really clear that ingesting a single bad idea will outweigh the entirety of the spend of your testing program. And we've seen this again across all of our customers, all the people that we've talked to as we're out evangelizing the good word of testing, is that one of these bad outcomes is far enough away for you to pay for your entire testing program. We're going to talk a little bit about a case study here. This actually is now a client, and we can talk a little bit about that. Obviously, we're going to protect some of our customer names here, but this particular client, before we got involved, had an idea around pricing, and that they would restructure their pricing in one of their key areas, and that their thought is that there was a little bit of value still left on the table, and that everybody else is raising pricing in similar segments, and so their customers would react in a positive way to this pricing, meaning they would still buy at the same rates or marginally less rates, but that would be made up for in the margin dollars here. The math made sense, the hope made sense. Their competitors were raising prices, so they went for it, and they did it. For a different reason, they started working with Market Dial and started testing and ingesting a bunch of new initiatives and future initiatives. Someone along the way said, "Hey, I wonder if we can look backwards and get an understanding of how well that pricing initiative worked." And so they created what's called a back test, or a natural experiment, which is to say, hey, we didn't construct it in the perfect way, but if I look back to that thing we did 8 months ago, can I do a kind of a reverse analysis of that and sort of get an approximate value? And they did. They designed it in our software and used that, and the results were very unsettling for them, which is they actually lost, and this is a revenue figure, they had lost 3% in revenue from this, which translated into a very big margin loss from that as you take that down the P&L. And they immediately dove in, looked at the results, had lots of meetings about this, and effectively reversed that pricing change that they had made because of this. And the stress for them is they had, for a few quarters, I think it's like 9 to 12 months, had been losing a ton of value, left it on the table. And the cost of testing, again, for them wasn't man, this is really expensive. We have to hire people or use software or change our price board or whatever we're doing. The cost for them that they were ingesting and that they were paying is losing multiple margin points in here, which is very unacceptable in all of our businesses here, where margin points are sacred. So the cost for them and for you really needs to shift from a small budget decrease to a huge business line that you're putting at risk without testing. The next bucket that we'll talk about here and mention before, and it's, as I mentioned, it's similar to the cost in terms of budget shifting. This one feels a little bit like a cost, or it can feel like a cost in terms of time. We don't have, we hear all the time, we don't have the time to put a testing bubble in place here. As soon as we come up with an idea that makes sense, we want to put it out there in the world so we can start getting the value from that. And if we slow that down by a couple weeks or even a couple months, that time is just so precious that it's costing us money, it's costing us leadership in the market, it's costing us whatever here. We don't have the time to run experiments. And the same thing is true with cost, is that with if you kind of look at that from a different way, these mistakes that we're making, if you're making mistakes faster, that's actually worse, right? So the ideal is that we make the right decision and we make that as quickly as possible, but we don't know which is the right decision. We don't know that which 25 to 35% of our initiatives are great or which 25 to 30% of initiatives are bad. And so just throwing them all out there means that we're going to be ingesting and putting into our business a bunch of bad ideas, and we're going to do it really quickly. So the offset here is, again, it's sort of a cost and efficiency mindset change, which is you can be quick. Putting ideas out there is definitely quicker, faster without testing. But you're ingesting bad ideas quicker, just like you're ingesting your good ideas quicker. The reality is, without running an experiment, once you put it out there, it's almost impossible to even look backwards and figure out which of them was good and which of them is bad. Some people have said, well, I'll put them out there, and if our sales decrease, I'll clearly know it's bad. And unfortunately, it just doesn't work that way. When you're making so many changes in your store or restaurant or whatever, those changes get muddled and mixed, and you're making labor changes and marketing changes and pricing changes. It is impossible to parse those apart. This is, if you take it to a drug sense, this is like, stopping the clinical trial at the earliest phases here. We have a good idea. This new medication seems to be working in the right way when we're testing it with very small populations, or we're not testing it at all. So let's just roll this out to do that. And nobody would take medication that has not been thoroughly tested and experimented on. The same thing is true here, is that this is very, very risky, and that time is very important to take and make sure we're doing it in the right way. There are definitely things that you can do to make this quicker. So if you are running experiments based on spreadsheets, or you're sort of having someone manually go out and collect the data, you're doing this all a manual process, that easily 10x's the time that an experiment takes. And so, again, understandably so, people look at this and say, well, I can spend, if somebody's doing an experiment by hand, it's taking, from our experience, 120 hours worth of time to grab the data, pick treatment stores, pick control stores, run that whole process. So someone in your shoes is looking down and saying, okay, I need to run that test, and that test might take me a month to get a good read, but it's going to take me another month just to go collect the data, go analyze design the test and analyze that. So while cutting out test time is not an option in most cases, what is an option is making everything else so much more efficient as well. So moving from manual processes, moving from what someone is doing by hand in an Excel or with SPSS or Python, and baking that into an automated testing process that takes minutes rather than that 120 hours. And software like MarketDial really helps you drive these things that's mentioned on the right. Is with that, you can in minutes really know How long do I need to let this run for? How confident will I be in these results if given a certain sample size and control size? We're going to pick those treatment and control. We can obviously run multiple tests simultaneously without them stepping on each other's toes. We'll keep them clean and the test cells optimized, and ensuring that you can do as many tests as you need to do while minimizing the amount of time that goes into it. So really clear example of, there are great ways to make testing more efficient. It still does, and sometimes sort of slow down, but it slows down in a good and a healthy way, moving methodically there. There's a few examples of this that we can do. These aren't a client of us. It's just a very public rushed for efficiency here. Very noble effort from Old Navy with this great new line. It has a better range of sizes and more inclusive and a better range of all their products here, which is a really great goal and target. Because of that, they rushed forward in their purchasing and entire process essentially to get this on the shelves. The problem is without rigorous testing, the inventory decisions and all of the decisions that sort of went into that weren't optimized. And so they were left in this really bad outcome where they had too many of some sizes, far too few in other sizes, led to costly markdown and clearance efforts, and really has hampered their long-term desire and capability, and honestly credibility in that particular space, because it didn't nail that mark. And so even in a really good and the right thing to do, which is to deliver the sizing and the clothing that our customers need and want, doing it in the right way, ensuring that you're doing it methodically, allows you to actually deliver on that goal and to deliver on that message instead of having to wrap it up and close down the effort, because we wanted to get it out a few weeks faster in that case. The next thing we'll talk about here is ability. And this, in some ways, has underpinned a lot of the discussion points that we've talked about before. But the perception is, and to some extent is right in a lot of ways, which is testing is hard, and it requires highly trained statisticians and data scientists. And either you don't have them on staff, or if you do, they are allocated to the pricing team, and they're trying to come up with those hypotheses around pricing or merchandising or labor and store ops or whatever their target is, and allocating that time back towards testing, which is a very specialized discipline, can be hard to do, especially when testing can be a bit of a shared service, because every org in that business needs to do testing. And so it's hard for, say, the marketing team to allocate their data scientists to allow the pricing team to be able to leverage them for testing reasons there. So that can cause a lot of people to just say, well, maybe my team will handle our own kind of small experiments or small runs. We won't sort of try to figure this out on a broader scale. And as you know, highly trained data scientists, statisticians are just really expensive, hard to come by, hard to recruit. And so that can just feel like a very daunting task. Similar to efficiency is there's very clear, easy ways to work around this. And in some cases, supercharge those data scientists to allow them to act like a team of 50 when they're a team of 1 or 2, or to take folks who aren't data scientists, who are really eager, who are smart, sharp pricing analysts who are new to the company, and arm them with the skills and capability that's needed without having to send them back for a master's of statistics, such that every team can effectively run their own experiments there. This is, obviously a little bit of a plug for us in some ways, but our entire goal is built around that, is that not every org has data scientists coming out their ear. And if they do have a lot of data scientists, they're often allocated to other tasks throughout the organization. Optimizing inventory, optimizing pricing or merchandising or space or whatever it is. And testing can be hard for folks to kind of make that case, because it is that shared organization. And so our entire attempt And goal here at Market Dial is to ensure that no matter who you are in the organization, whether you are a C-level, you're a CFO who's trying to make ROI and budget decisions across organizations, you're the head of merchandising who's trying to, do buying and space planning efforts here, or you're that brand new labor analyst who's trying to optimize how much labor goes into each of our stores at any given time, that you can effectively design and analyze experiment, again, in a matter of minutes rather than dozens or hundreds of hours there as it comes up. So what this looks like in a few different ways is that our clients really are able to go from running handfuls of experiments to, depending on the client, hundreds of experiments throughout a year. And the limitation goes from being a very team-centered limitation and capacity limitation to how many credible ideas do we have? How much testing can our fleet sustain using the statistics that are there? One of our clients had this expectation that they would have a handful of users of our software. They were thinking, this would be a really complicated and statistically complicated thing. So they at first we started working with their cream of the crop statistical team. I remember them all by name, and they are cream of the crop. They can do this. In a lot of ways, they can really make a valid test every single time. There's challenges, complications, but they could do it. The problem going back to this is it would take 120 hours on average for them to do that. And then if any changes came along the way, say one of your treatment sites was no longer able to run in the test, they would kind of have to go back to the drawing board, and they would add dozens of hours to go repick and rebalance that sample appropriately. And so they went from really being time and human constrained because of that, and were able to open their users from a handful of folks to hundreds of people. And because of that, it democratized throughout the organization such that their marketing teams, their space teams, their merchants, their store renovations, remodels, their labor optimizations teams, every team is using it. And not only that, at the capital allocation level is whenever there's, and for this client, it's a small number, whenever there's a need for $3 million or more in budget, it has to have an experiment tied to that, a Market Dial experiment at that, tied with that, because it's so important for the executive leadership to be able to say, okay, I believe in the outcomes, I believe in the ROI. This one is a clear winner. This one is also a winner, but not as ROI centric. And so let's invest in A, but not B. And so going from a few users who can design 5 or 10 tests a year through hundreds of users designing hundreds of tests, all while maintaining quality, it's not chaos, all those kind of important things really is the key underpinning here. So the ability should not be a problem, and it should not be that restraint, because there's a lot there, from us that you can really leverage that and increase your team's quality essentially overnight and capacity there. The last one, maybe it's left last because it is big and it is hard here, is really the change management and the organizational religion of sorts of here, which is, hey, in the past, we've always relied on our intuition, and look, it's got us this far. We're clearly doing something. We have hundreds of stores, billions of dollars of revenue. We have happy customers. Our brand is well loved. So why should we not just continue to do that? Our habit has got us to this point. The reality is that is the arc mostly for every brand, every retailer, which is when it starts, the reason why it grows is more or less not because of some genius operator that's there. It's that there was lightning in a bottle, that brand at that right time with those right people and the right consumers there at the right price point just perfectly nailed that opportunity, and it grows like wildfire even, and it does really, really well. And the odd mistake that was put into the business just doesn't matter, because the consumer pull and the consumer demand is so strong. What happens though is, as our businesses all scale, there becomes a point when that growth rate starts to change slightly. You're still comping up, but maybe it's lower than you've done the prior few quarters. And that starts to change, and your input and your costs start to go up. Your partners are starting to try to extract more of the value from this chain that they've helped you create. And so from your position, it becomes super, super important to optimize every decision. And we've had this countless times where we talk to a brand and they're maybe on the left-hand side, which is everything is great. No matter what we put on the shelves works. We can start a whole new men's line where we have no credibility, and it just works from here. And then over time, as that brand scales, they start shifting to the right-hand side, which is intuition and instinct are not what's going to drive you in the future. If that was the case, you'd be a zillion-dollar brand, take over the entire world, and that's nobody believes that's the truth here. Past things that worked for you might not work in the future. So you've always done things a certain way, but now to hit that next level of consumer, you might need to offer in a different way, or at a different price point, or different packaging, or different marketing messaging. And what you've done today has got you your current customers. They're not going to get you your next customers. And changing that mind shift or that mindset can be a bit of a shift. And sometimes it's not something that you can just sort of brute force and help the organization change overnight. It might take comps sort of going sideways for a little bit, or other external factors, before we all look internally and say, hey, we need to really focus on optimization. We need to focus on everything. We need to get our inventory tight. We need to get our supply chain tight. We need to get our stores tight. Every single part of our business, we need to operate at the very, very highest peak. And that shift can be helped and can be pushed along by folks, but sometimes it takes an external factor. The comforting thing, though, is that as that shift happens, all of these decisions are, while unique to you, meaning, hey, what price point should I have this particular item or garment at? What marketing message is going to get that millennial consumer, or whatever the target is here? Those are different and those are unique, and nobody has been in your exact same shoes and tried to do that. So it's very, very complicated. The way to understand that success is very straightforward. People have been running the scientific method for eons. It's used in every part of our lives in order to prove what works and what doesn't. And the same is the case here, is that numbers and data and the scientific method really are the comforting factor to rely on here, which is, we can figure it out. Let's run experiments. Let's test this. Let's be rigorous about what we're doing. And if we do our job right, we'll get very clear direction from the market and from our experiments to say which steps we should take. A couple of these, client examples from us, which show a little bit of a change in habit, again, from we didn't have this discipline to, wow, we're grateful that we have this discipline, are sort of twofold. We'll talk about two. The top one here is from a grocery client where they were considering adding additional gluten-free products. They had the baselines, but they were considering adding them. As you know, the supply of these is complicated. It's expensive. It's different than your normal supply in a lot of cases. And so it can just feel like a very expensive thing. And as the trends and things shift, there are a lot of consumers who are demanding it, but it's unclear if that will sustain or how long we should invest in that. And so this particular retailer was really, really nervous about this. They ran a series of experiments. This wasn't just sort of one for it, but a series of experiments where they tested which items, how deep in each items, how premium or budget they should go with each of these items. And essentially what they saw across the board is that there was no limit for their consumers at this time for how much gluten-free product they valued and that they wanted in their grocery outlet. And so for them, it made it very, very clear that they should make this investment, and that the ROI for them was happier customers who spent more money, their basket sizes were bigger, and they repeated more frequently. And as a grocer, that's the gold standard. That's everything that they're dreaming of here. Now, that might change, right? As they continue to experiment and watch their consumer demand over years and decades, this might get shifted, that might get replaced, the different offerings, the options for gluten-free might change. But at that moment, at that time, they were able to really have a lot of confidence, even though they're making a big series of decisions around how deep to go on gluten-free. Similar to this, a convenience store client of ours had this target. They wanted to give free coffee on a certain day of the week to bring new business in. Coffee transactions have a certain outcome for this particular convenience store, and they had great basket sizes. If someone turned into a coffee buyer, they would repeat more frequently, and they were just very valuable consumers to have. So as a way to sort of build that funnel of great consumers, one of the ideas that they had was to do free coffee on a certain day of the week that was already disproportionately low, but hopefully to bring those customers in at different points. What happened was actually quite the opposite. So instead of just sort of throwing it out there, they were able to design and analyze an experiment around this. And this one was pretty quick to kill, because it was exceptionally bad. It was a very different consumer than their traditional coffee consumers. Their basket was essentially zero. It was a cup of free coffee. They only came back to the store on free coffee days, and they basically only got free coffee, and they just were not the consumers that they were hoping for. So instead of building this great new funnel of loyal brand advocates, they just gave away free coffee to random folks who didn't value and didn't turn into a longer term consumer for that convenience store. Again, done without experimentation, it would be very hard to sort of understand that. It didn't tank their business. They weren't giving away, $1 billion in margin. It wasn't obvious if you looked at it across everything else, because these were folks that weren't showing up before. So it wasn't that they were even giving away coffee to their consumers who were buying coffee prior. They were giving away coffee to people who had never come into the store before and would never come back to that store. And so it wasn't obvious that without testing that you could suss out that that's exactly what's happening here. So really, really important to sort of go from that habit, the just hypothesis, going right from a good idea straight to accept or reject, and to inject that testing process throughout there. The term here that we like to think about really is failure foresight in a way. If every idea that you had worked, we wouldn't have a job, and frankly, you would be in a different business, probably just a different prediction market. You'd be a trillionaire. You'd be amazing. The reality is, we all need to, in order to find what's working for our business, have some clear wins. We need to have some neutral ones where it's not obvious that it was good or bad. And we're going to, along that way, have losses. If we don't have losses, we're clearly not pushing hard enough to drive that business forward. And our entire goal is to give you foresight into those failures. We want to stop you from ingesting those. And experimentation as business practice really is the thing that helps you do that. I've talked about this briefly throughout, so I won't go a ton. Our whole goal at Market Dial, again, is really to help you with that failure foresight, and to help avoid those costs and mistakes. Of course, we want to give you confidence, and we want to high five you and celebrate you with you when things are great. Frankly, we don't get a lot of credit for that, because of course you're smart, of course your teams are smart, you've made the right calls, the right bets, when in reality, we find ourselves a lot of time in the loss avoidance territory, and there's a lot of value in there. Hundreds of X of ROI that we cost can be found in just not doing a handful of those bad ideas. And so our whole entire job is to help you celebrate the wins, understand the neutrals, and tweak and learn from those, and to, as quickly as possible, kill those losing ideas and learn from those, and build something else that goes forward there. I'll leave the summary page here as we're transitioning over to Q&A if there's any. But really, there's the common hurdles here with a very small mindset shift should turn into opportunities for us to do it quickly, efficiently, low cost, and to bring that business along with us, and to help change the organizational desire there. So I'm going to rope Fraser back in, and if we have any Q&A, happy to tackle some. If we don't, happy to call it a day as well.
Yeah, you bet, Morgan. Thank you for that. We do actually have some questions that have come in. The first question is, it says, you mentioned back testing in one of your examples. Is that the primary testing you are talking about, or is there a difference between back testing and testing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in a way, testing is testing. So all testing is beneficial, and what you can learn from them are different things. Not all tests are back tests or forward-looking tests. And the way that I would differentiate here is a back test has already happened, and it might have been because of you. It might have been because of a competitor. So you've been minding your own business, and a competitor starts opening stores right next door to your outlets, and that is not a test you designed. You didn't want that test. In fact, it'd be better if that competitor didn't exist, because you could own the entire market. But it is happening. So in more scientific disciplines, those would be called the natural experiment there. And from those, what we can learn is still very similar stuff, but not as clean, not as pure. It's not as elegant of an answer. But what we can learn is, given what we've seen, was there a negative impact on the stores where a competitor opened nearby? Was it a positive impact when there was more competitive density in some of those stores? And so when we say a back test or a natural experiment, there are things that have two characteristics. Well, one plus maybe a second. One is it happened in the past, that's back test. And then second is you may or may not have been the instigator of that test. It just sort of happened without you. The best practice, though, by the way, natural experiments are used there. I think someone won a Nobel Prize about how natural experiments can be used to understand minimum wage changes. Like, it's a very important part of experimental design and practice here. So very important topic. The best case scenario, though, is really falls down to kind of future test, or test in which you can design a good experiment and then analyze those experiments there. And the way that that looks is you get the chance to be thoughtful about how you set up the experiment. You get to be the one to decide which stores get the treatment. They get the new pricing model. They get the new labor model. You get to pick those stores. You get to pick how many stores. You get to pick when you want to run it, how long you want to run that experiment for. You get to pick control stores without having to take much into consideration here. And so when you can do that, the benefits of a forward-looking test are that the statistical significance and the confidence that you're going to have on the outcomes are a lot higher, because you were able to create the test in such a way that is discrete, meaning you're just testing the single thing or the group of things that you want to do, and it's appropriately powered or sized so that when you hope to get a 3% margin lift, if you see that 3% margin lift, we're going to be 95% confident or 98% confident in those results. A lot of times on back tests, you have to kind of take what you get, where you didn't get to pick the treatment store. So maybe there's a little bit of bias in those results, or you didn't get to pick the number of stores that received that experiment from there. And so maybe even though you saw a 10% margin lift, we're only 80% confident that that's due to that event. And so back tests are great. We should learn from those as much as we can. But what you can learn is sort of limited, because you've sort of done the thing. You didn't get to design it right. Whereas forward-looking tests really are your opportunity to design it really, really well on treatment selection, control selection, how big and how long we're going to run this test for. And then you can analyze it and get a lot more crystal results from that. So both are valuable for different reasons, but good question.
I'm going to turn my video on, get my 60 seconds of fame back. Looks like we've got 3 more questions. This next one is a 2-for-1. Would you say more companies test than don't test? And how many retailers would you say rely on testing?
Oh, man, if I had this clear answer, I think my life would be a lot easier. So in various ways, almost every company does some form of testing. I think that's a fair statement to have. But what types of things they're testing tends to be very different. And sometimes they stop really early in that testing, or most often I would say they stop kind of early in the testing. So what a test could look like in a retail org is, hey, we want to run this new employee training program. This is a real example from one of our clients. They were getting beat on price in a relative commodity area here. And so they had a few options. They could do nothing and just kind of take it. They could try to match price. They could do all these different things. What they picked was kind of innovative and really cool, which is, what if we trained our employees better to have more product knowledge and be able to speak to the value of the product that they were competing on? And is a small part of their overall sales. But what if we could train those employees better? Ultimately, what they needed to run is a full experiment, and they did that. And they ran 40. They trained all of the employees in that department in 40 of their stores, and they spent millions of dollars doing this, and it was a big effort, and it did work. And so that is what a lot of people think of when we're talking about scientific experiments. Before that even happened, they did a test as well, but it was more a test of, can we actually find training that our employees will take and value, and that we can teach them something as a result of this. And so they did, in 1 or 2 stores, they did a very manual version of this. And that wasn't a test to learn the statistical impact from labor training. That was a test of, can we actually do the thing? Can we communicate in this right way to our employees? Or if we're going to do a very complicated end cap, I see this every time around the Super Bowl. Everybody has a very fancy Coke or Pepsi or Dr. Pepper sort of tower of 12 packs. I have no idea how they can communicate that effectively to stores, and it actually works. That's magic. I don't understand that. A test in that case is, can we actually send a picture of this very wild football display and have someone recreate it? And that's a different kind of test. That's not a statistical test. That's an execution test. Almost every company does execution tests. The problem is the majority of companies stop at execution tests. If they say, oh, we can do this thing, so we should do this thing. That's a dangerous leap to make. You really have 2 separate questions to answer there, which is, can I execute it? And should I execute it? Can you execute it is, lots of testing goes into there and in-market stuff. When we get involved and when statistics get involved is, should I execute it? And so I don't know the raw numbers, but I would say maybe every company, every retailer, every business, everybody's doing some form of testing or execution testing in some form or fashion. But it is a much smaller number who are doing sort of rigorous statistical testing. And I would put those in 2 buckets. The first is, they've had it as part of their culture for a really long time. They run a bunch of tests a year. They have a really well-oiled system. My guess is that's 10% of retailers, broadly speaking, CPGs, FMCGs, that kind of space. There's a bigger bucket of people who sort of have the religion, they have the desire, they want to do it, but maybe they can't scale, they can't do those things. I'd maybe put like 30% of retailers in that bucket in there, a really good chunk. They want to, they understand the need and even the rough mechanics, but they can't permeate it throughout their entire organization for maybe one of these reasons we've talked about today. And then, whatever's left, half or more of these organizations, 60%, really are sort of, driving by putting their hand over the gas gauge a little bit here and trying to just maybe kind of ignore the levels and or they haven't thought that this is an important part of their business. Their gut is sort of driving it. And there's a large number of people that are in that zone. And it's a really dangerous zone to be in, but a lot of businesses are in there. I can't remember if I answered both of them.
Yeah, no, that definitely is. And I think that hit on that misconception of habit, where we have experience in the past and we use that to drive forward.
Yeah.
Okay. Looks like 2 more questions, if we've got time for that.
Sure.
What things do you see retailers testing the most?
Unfortunately, this is another annoying answer. It's very broad and it changes by vertical. It changes even by particular retailer over a period of time. So what they're prioritizing at that exact moment. In convenience, there was this like really there's been a few sort of trends that have happened, like better coffee in our stores. We talked about one that was doing free coffee, but there's this trend towards better, maybe even kind of third wave coffee that is a better experience. And it seemed like every convenience retailer was just heavily investing in coffee, and therefore doing a bunch of testing around what is the right offering, what's the right value ratio, what's all that kind of good stuff. And so that will happen. And then once they feel like they've got to a good place, they'll sort of have another set of initiatives. And in these cases, they were doing things like EV charging and the value of that and the costs and all those kind of important things. And so they sort of change, and sometimes the whole industry will do it. Sometimes a particular retailer will do it. The big rough buckets, though, if you think about it, is most functional organizations in your business will have testing as the natural outcome, or they'll have hypotheses as their outcome, and testing is that kind of final step. So there's a pricing team. They're running obviously lots of pricing, sometimes promotional activity through there. There's a space team. There's a group of buyers here. There's store ops and labor teams. And all of those teams have one goal, which is I need to drive the total business and my part of that business forward. I need more sales, better margin, more efficiency, whatever their KPIs are. And testing is that next logical step after they've done their part, which is looking at data, analyzing the data, and coming up with a hypothesis of how they're going to drive their part of the business forward. And that next step is let's go run a bunch of tests. So they tend to sort of break down in those buckets, but the flavors of that, there's not, unfortunately, just like 70% of retailers are doing price testing every day. It really varies over time and with different verticals.
Okay. Perfect. I said there, looks like we had one more come in. So we got two more. Can you explain the testing process for someone who hasn't really done much testing?
Yeah. So there's two parts of the testing process. There's two sort of versions of it, and it's two sides of the same coin. But the big macro thing that we're plugging into really is the scientific method here. And we obviously didn't come up with it. It's been used for a very long time. It starts with good observational insights. So there's lots of teams, lots of tools, lots of software there that helps you have that. So that's your database, that's your CRM, that's Tableau, there's lots of BI tools there that can help you understand what's going on in the market. And an observation looks like our competitor opened a store next door to us, or hey, we're losing sales in produce. What should we do with this? So that's an observation. A hypothesis is what you're going to do to try to capitalize on that observation, to say, okay, well, our competitor's opening stores next to us. Maybe we should train our employees better. Maybe we can lower our prices. Maybe we can do these things. So everybody in the business will be thinking about that observation and what they can do to kind of capitalize on that. And then the next stage, which we talked about, is to run an experiment on the best hypotheses that boil up. And we're going to run all those experiments. And once those are done, and then you can analyze those, and the good ones we accept. If they clear your ROI hurdles, and the bad ones we can kill. And that's kind of all we've talked about today. In that, though, that testing phase really has a few buckets, and I'll talk very briefly about it. But when you have a hypothesis, the way to sort of go from hypothesis to accept or reject is to understand how important or how big that hypothesis could be. Meaning, we're going to change our prices. We think this can drive 4% margin increase in our candy category. Okay, that's like a very good hypothesis here. Once you have that, you really need to understand how much of our stores is going to change. Is it just candy categories, or is it also our soda or whatever that's often attached? From there, you need to understand how big a test needs to be to answer this question, and how long you need to let it run for. And that's a function of how noisy your sales or your margin data is for that candy category. And so in a very not noisy category, it's easy. Maybe it's 5 stores, 6 stores, who knows? But in a very noisy or seasonal category, it could take 50 stores to get to the same answer. And so you have to do the statistical significance testing in there to figure out how big of a sample do I need. Then you need to pick treatment stores. So if we need 50 sites, we need to pick the best 50 sites. And those 50 sites need to look like and behave like your entire fleet and your entire population. So those 50 need to represent the rest of your chain most often, or the population that we're looking at. And then we need to pick control stores. Once you have all of that, you can have a test design. And this is part of the reason why it can feel daunting, right? Like, do I have the ability to go do all this by hand? And how long will that take me to run all of these statistical tests? And so a lot of our value really is helping people design experiments day in and day out really quickly. Once the test is running, you've gone and made those price change in those 50 stores. There's a bunch of analysis that has to happen, and it tends to happen in 3 stages, which is what actually happened. And there's lots of statistical tests to do this. You can even just pull like a difference in differences regression and say, what is the pre-post net of control lift for the candy category after we change the pricing? So that part is relatively straightforward, but time consuming to do. Then the next question is, well, why did it work better in some stores than others? Because there will always be a gradation of, man, store 101 really kicked butt, and store 705 was really lagging on this, and maybe it had a negative impact. So what were the things that drove that? What characteristics about the consumers or the stores or whatever were there in the positive and not there in the negative? And then once you have that, there's a really complicated effort to go and say, okay, well, knowing what I know about that, where should I roll this out to? Should I just put it across my entire fleet? Or should I tailor that rollout and say, only put it in my East Coast stores and not my West Coast stores, or certain regions should get that price increase when others shouldn't? And so only then can you then go back to that hypothesis and say, this was a good idea or a bad idea, and should we accept it or should we reject it? And so therein lies a lot of the stress around the ability to be able to do this. But again, there's help and hope for us in here in MarketDial, and able to help you do the steps from hypothesis to accept or reject.
Awesome. Okay, we got just about 60 more seconds for one last question. Do you think automated testing platforms supplant or support data scientists?
Support. Yeah, no question. And for 2 reasons. One is it really, platforms like this supercharge data scientists. That it's similar to asking if Python supplants or supports a data scientist, and it's more of a tool in the hands of people, and some statistically gifted people can use Python or not. And MarketDial is obviously a lot easier to use, and approachable, but it has the capacity to supercharge those folks and give them a lot of capacity, either to do 100x more testing, or to reallocate the part of their day that was dedicated to testing back towards other different higher order things. Like, what should we do? How can we capitalize on what's going on in the market right now, and really put them in the best place possible to drive the business forward? So our best users and partners are definitely oftentimes the data science crew, for sure.
Perfect. Okay, well, those are all of our questions. Thank you so much, Morgan, for going over this case for in-store testing. And then we appreciate everyone tuning in. We'll be sending out a copy of this video after the webinar in the next few days. So keep an eye out for that. But again, thanks, Morgan, and we'll see you.
Thanks, everyone.
Later.